Hi everyone and a warm welcome to another episode of Single Issues I Love, a series of videos in which I look at some of my favorite single comics issues. The comic I'm going to be talking about today is a nostalgic favorite of mine. It's one of the earliest superhero comic books that I remember reading, and nostalgia, it's a bit of a tricky thing. If unchecked, it can create this overly sentimental attachment to things, and other criteria of evaluation or discrimination can get overpowered simply because of that sentimental feeling. But nostalgia can also play a good foundational formational part. So there can be a type of nostalgia which is about the building blocks, and the comic that I want to talk about today is, I think, in that second category for me, because today I'm talking about The Amazing Spider-Man number 230, To Fight the Unbeatable Foe. This is, on its surface, a pretty simple and lean story. It's about a superhero and a supervillain fighting in a city, beating each other up, breaking and smashing things. But it is, in many ways, to me, the quintessential Spider-Man story. And I hope to get into a little bit of what I mean by a quintessential story for me, and try to identify those elements in this particular issue that make it such a formative and foundational comic for me. So let's change the camera angle and take a closer look at The Amazing Spider-Man number 230. My nostalgia for this issue starts from the cover, not just the front cover, which I think is quite impressive, with the Juggernaut over here completely out of proportion, with Spider-Man making him look like a force of nature, which in many ways he is. The sort of television or newspaper black and white of him contrasting against the red and the blue. This is just a very interesting cover and very different from many of the other covers that didn't have that kind of separation, or at least what I was familiar with at that time. This nostalgia also extends, incidentally, to the inside front cover, which I'm pretty sure in my young life was the first time I encountered baseball. Striking out, strike two, all of these phrases, I'm pretty sure were first introduced to me in this Cracker Jack ad. That's how influential this comic is. To Fight the Unbeatable Foe, I would find out many years later, was a song lyric, a pretty famous song lyric. I even have thought when I first encountered this somewhere else that they were making a reference to this Spider-Man story. That's how deeply influenced, and that's how deeply influential I thought this story was. To Fight the Unbeatable Foe is the second part of a two-part story, which makes it an unusual choice for single issues I love, but I encountered it as a standalone read. I hadn't read the first part of it, and in fact, it was to be more than 2 decades, I think, before I would ever get to read the first part of this story. But it did not matter, and this is one of those deeply formative things in this comic as a second part. It sums up what happened in the first part on the first splash page. So the style of these sort of desaturated, monochromatic or duotone flashbacks, the narrative given to you in the caption boxes, all against this one pose, a very classic Spidey pose, terrific kind of angle. All of these things immediately get me into this story. I'm immediately caught up with what's happened, where Madam Web has been attempted to be kidnapped by the Juggernaut. She's been ripped off her life support chair and is now in a coma. Spider-Man couldn't stop it and was defeated, and now he's chasing the Juggernaut. All of these things are given to you in this one page with a terrific economy that I think the rest of the issue keeps up with. And then we jump straight into the action. This story is, as I said, a kind of simple and lean one. It's essentially a chase across New York. The Juggernaut's trying to get to the harbor. It's just a series of action sequences, as it were, in which Spider-Man's trying to stop the Juggernaut and the different things he tries, with some other scenes interspersed in between. The most impressive thing about this issue for me is the panel layouts. As a child and as a teenager growing up, I think this was subconsciously an object lesson in how layout affects the movement and the action, not just of the story, but of the reader's eye through the page. This narrow, long panel over here shows you Spider-Man hopping over the rooftops, a rather classic sort of sequence. This movement with the two impact points of where he's bounced off in order to reach over here is classic comics vocabulary that I was being introduced to. Very famous, iconic Spider-Man poses, giving you a lot of athleticism and making you feel not just the velocity but the sort of gymnastics that he is capable of and what he is using. But at the same time, you've got this thought process of this guilt, of this anger, of him trying to catch the Juggernaut, which is immediately contrasted with the thoughts of the Juggernaut. Thought bubbles are not very cool or sexy these days. They're hardly ever used, but thought bubbles were a significant part of the comics vocabulary that I grew up with, especially in superhero comics. Now, I can completely understand why they're not that interesting to people these days. I think they can be overdone, and there are, even at this time, a lot of comics that really overdid it. But I'm quite fond of the narration in this story taking place in these parallel characters as they're thinking about things. What's driving them on, the anger and irritation that each of them is feeling being given to you with these internal monologues was just terrific. This long panel over here establishes for us very clearly this scaffolding and construction that's going on in the foreground. The colors are still distinguishing for you the Juggernaut back there. As Spider-Man jumps in over here, creates a little slingshot and chucks a girder at the Juggernaut, we're very clear about the action and what's going on over here. This is one of the things that I really love about this comic, is that you're never confused as to what's going on over here. Everything is being set up for you and established for you very clearly, but in parallel, we've got what Peter Parker, what Spider-Man is thinking, what the Juggernaut is thinking. So the action and the thoughts are both very clear, both very explicit, and that I think is one of the things that this comic does marvelously. This catapulted girder just sort of hanging in mid-air over the Juggernaut and him catching it with a little tuck. These two panels are superb. They give you a sense of his reflexes, of how fast he moves, of how aware he is of his surroundings, and of his strength, and the effortlessness of his catch. All of these things done without real, actual movement lines in these panels themselves. So although the girder is being shot forward and that's shown with lines in this panel, the fact that there are no lines in this panel helps it be frozen in mid-air. The relative speed of his reflexes and the effortlessness uses comics vocabulary perfectly, in my opinion. The previously established construction area beyond the scaffolding is then ripped into by the Juggernaut when he has noticed that that's where the attack came from. And then we get these 4 vertical columns. Again, a very economical and very effective way of telling you where these characters are to each other, what their powers are. There's Spider-Man sticking to a wall, and there's the Juggernaut essentially ripping an entire building's corner off. And once again, as a reader, you are not lost, but you are also being more deeply immersed into the story of their powers and their conflict. On the next page, you've got more of that variation between the vertical and the horizontally laid out panels, with 2 horizontal panels showing you Spider-Man's movement across the landscape, one in a wide shot, one in a closer shot. And this horizontal close-up of him grabbing this cable leading into this sort of vertical panel of him spiraling down that cable is another one of my favorite action sequences. This whole sequence of how high up he is, of where he bounces to, how he comes down to ground level, continues the velocity of this battle and continues to lead the reader's eye to the action in the effortless way that this entire comic has already been doing and will continue to do. This hammer throw of the wrecking ball and the Juggernaut standing up to it, given to us in these panels, leads into a reverse shot of him slamming it into the wall and then the wall crumbling down. All of this is happening really fast, but the way that this comic slows down the right moments of action to give us his spider sense tingling and his reflexes making him take cover while the rubble comes down on top of them is very cinematic, but at the same time uniquely comics. This one page has a fair amount of action, but it's really a question of these pages one after the other with a seamlessly flowing action action sequence that gives it its power. This panel over here of a 3-story jump by Spider-Man is given to us only in text. There's nothing relative behind us to know how high he's jumping, but it wouldn't really have been effective anyway. We wouldn't have been able to know that it's 3 stories. So where we choose to have an image and where we choose to have text married to, sort of almost an isolated image is, again, in my opinion, perfectly chosen. Then we've got a scene at the Daily Bugle, which is a traditional way to break up the action, show us what's going on somewhere else, propel, larger parts of the continuity. There's something going on with Lance Bannon, who's not a character I'm familiar with, before going back to Black Tom, waiting for the Juggernaut, seeing him through his binoculars, and seeing Spider-Man chasing him, which segues us back into the central conflict. Over here, we have Spider-Man running out of webbing in his right hand, this graceful gymnastic fall, using another Spider-Man trope of these shadowy Spider-Man figures to give us motion, which is as classic as this earlier movement shot that we had seen, where you only have one figure but points of impact and arcs shown to you. In this, it's the various positions of the body, but he also runs out of webbing in his other hand. He lands on top of a truck and checks his belt to find that he's completely out of webbing, and he's apparently used it up in the previous battle, the previous issue's battle. This is where the story for me as a kid became a very interesting Spider-Man story. There have always been 2 aspects of this particular superhero for me. One has been the powers of a spider, and the other has been his brains as a science whiz. In some stories, he would get beaten, then he would go back to his laboratory and he would use his science brain to create better webbing, to create an insulated suit against electrical shocks or something like that. And it was his scientific gizmo gadgetry coming to the rescue where his physical strength has failed. This story, in this part of it, takes that science aspect out of it, or at least the gadget aspect out of it. Now he's out of webbing, so all he has to rely on is his strength, speed, agility, which is immediately shown to you in this comic scene of this truck driver trying to attack him and Spider-Man intimidating him, which leads him to conveniently abandon this truck again in one of these nice, narrow, horizontal panels presented to you that Spider-Man says, hey, maybe I can use this against the Juggernaut. Which he immediately does, slightly irresponsibly, I think. Spider-Man gets into this semi-truck full of fuel and has it crash into the Juggernaut, who doesn't even move, who just stands there and takes it. You've got this bound, and unlike that other 3-story bound, this one is framed against some background because of the depth of it gives you relative scale, giving you a sense of how far away or at least how high he's jumping. And this kind of terrific movement is contrasted against the Juggernaut, who doesn't move an inch and takes this huge, almost full page explosion. This, I think, is a very effective splash page, even though it's not a full page splash, even though there isn't a lot of hyper detail in it. I think that really works to how effective this is. It's mainly fire and smoke. So the impact of the explosion, in which you just have the silhouette of the exploding truck as a tiny little portion of this huge image, was incredibly effective. Once again, the way that the size of these panels are contrasted against each other in order to tell this simple story of this huge fight, I thought at that time, and continue to think, is extremely well done. This leads to these pages in which Spider-Man is watching this fire, and then unbelievably we get a full sense of how unbelievable this is with the close-up on his face over these panels, interspersed with the emerging figure from the fire and this terrific image of the Juggernaut encased in flame walking out of the fire, and then the hydrant and the steam. And here's another great panel with a cement mixer and this deep foundation of cement in the foreground, Spider-Man and the Juggernaut just way back there. It just looks like a stylish camera angle, but obviously it's foreshadowing what's going to happen next, which is still going to be a surprise. but you've got to wait for a couple of pages, turn past the ads. You've got the big lumbering Juggernaut swinging at Spider-Man, very athletic, very agile. The drawings here are terrific. There's no wonder that this was the Spider-Man of my youth. So even when looking at a not very sophisticated animation on TV, I could see him move much more elegantly in the comics because of these kind of things. He grabs onto the Juggernaut's helmet, he grabs him from behind and closes his eyes. And this is probably my favorite page in this comic, where the Juggernaut rips his shirt off and starts pounding on him. You've got these little stars starting to appear, in which you know that Spider-Man's being beaten to within an inch of his life. Of course, his mask, his clothes being torn is sort of a trope. And for me, this is one of those formative things. This is how I learned to recognize that trope, because of the kind of absolute pounding that he takes over here. And as he's being pounded, he's pretty sure he's dead. And so it's only in these 4 panels. It's not very long, drawn out. It's not page after page. It's within this very slim little issue. It's these 4 panels in which Spider-Man feels that it's over, like he has nothing else to give, but he can't give up. He's got to keep holding on. He's got to try to stop the Juggernaut, but he's not going to be able to. And this idea, even the word responsibility, a very loaded word in the Spider-Man world, comes back up over here, that it's what he has to do even if he dies. Of course, the Juggernaut finds that he has stumbled onto this deep foundation, something that was set up for us earlier, this deep concrete foundation being laid for this building, and he's slowly sinking into it like quicksand. Spider-Man jumps away. Over here we've got another one of those text things where he's so exhausted, where he thinks to himself, is like, I'm amazed that I could jump even 3 feet, let alone 30, which means he pretty much jumped 30 feet out from the center of this thing into which the Juggernaut had stumbled, because Spider-Man had his arms wrapped around his eyes and he didn't realize it. He starts sinking. I read this comic a long time before I saw Terminator 2, and so with the explosions, the fire, the sinking, a lot of these things do remind me of movies like that. And of course, Terminator movies and the Juggernaut have a lot of similarities. I suppose they're both, talking about unstoppable forces. But the idea of this guy who's now run out of webbing, who's exhausted, who was already beaten up from the issue before, not giving up, holding on, was really what impressed me as a kid, what impressed upon me the character of Spider-Man, of what kind of a different superhero he was. And right at the end, you've got one of those rare situations in which his camera was on. He did manage to take photographs and he did manage to sell them. Very often he doesn't, and it's all in vain. Those are much sadder Spider-Man stories. This one's not happy exactly, because when he gets to the hospital, Madam Web is still in a coma. He has this thinking about, even though he's uneasy with the fact that she knows his secret identity, he still thinks of her as some sort of a friend, as someone he shares something with. And so it's still a bit of a downer of an ending for him, but it's really his resilience, his never stopping of trying, and him getting that small reward. Even though he's not really that interested, he asks Robbie to do the voucher and runs off to the hospital, which is why, in a nutshell, this comic is the quintessential Spider-Man story for me. I'm not saying it's the best thing ever written, it's the best thing ever drawn, although it's pretty close for me, but it captures all of the nature of superheroics, of not just being about the powers and the abilities and the grand destruction, but the responsibility, the camaraderie, the feeling of duty, the feeling of guilt, the ideas of not giving up, the ideas of going to your last breath. Those are the things that really define a hero, but also how superhero comics, how the choreography of them, how the action choreography, how the scene settings, of how the switching between characters and the continuation of longer storylines and the planting of small seeds and the propagation of tiny plot points in the background, all while giving us a ballet of conflict and destruction front and center. A lot of that vocabulary and a lot of those stylistic tropes for me came from To Fight the Unbeatable for the Amazing Spider-Man number 230. If you enjoyed this video, check out the other videos in my Single Issues I Love series in a playlist on our channel page and linked in the description below. And I'd love to know which comics you consider to be those formative building block comics for you. This has been For the Love of Comics. Thank you as always for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.